Yes, it's clearly a disaster of the first order. First of all, you want to understand that the president had four objectives. One was regime change. Two was to put an end to the nuclear enrichment program inside Iran. Three was to put an end to its long range missile capability. And number four was to end support, Iranian support for the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. They have failed clearly and in terms of achieving any of those objectives. And furthermore, on top of that, the Strait of Hormuz is now under the control of the Iranians, which was not the case on February 27th. Number two, we have basically created a situation where our bases in the Gulf area are either badly damaged or destroyed. We've fractured the alliance structure that we had with the Gulf states. The international economy is in terrible straits, and there's a great danger if this war keeps on that we'll go off a cliff and end up in a world depression.
A war designed to weaken Iran may have created a much bigger problem. John Mearsheimer argues that Washington failed to achieve its major objectives, and that Iran has emerged with something potentially far more powerful, leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. But his warning goes beyond the battlefield. He says America's position is getting weaker the longer the conflict continues. Gulf alliances have been damaged, and the economic consequences could extend far beyond the Middle East. And now, according to Mearsheimer, the hardest question isn't how this war started. It's how Washington gets out. Mearsheimer's argument is bigger than whether one side won a particular battle. He's saying the strategic balance itself has changed. The United States entered this conflict with specific objectives. But in his assessment, those goals remain unresolved while the costs have expanded, from military resources and Gulf security to one of the world's most important energy corridors. And that's where the next problem begins. The longer this continues, the harder an acceptable exit may become.
Well, it's hard to disagree with him, but let me just add to what he said, because it's not just the fact that we got into this war. It's the fact that Trump has missed a number of opportunities to put an end to it and instead has doubled down. The war starts on February 28th, and the first major ceasefire is on April 8th. That's when the 40-day bombing campaign ends. Now, at that point in time, it would have made sense for Trump to cut a deal. But instead of doing that, what he does is he puts the blockade on April 13th, and he continues to play hardball with the Iranians. Finally, on June 17th, he ends the blockade and he signs the Memorandum of Understanding. This is the off-ramp, right? But what does he do? He violates the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding, and it is the United States that violates it in early July. And what we then start doing is engaging in a tit-for-tat campaign, right? And then what happens on July 23rd, this past Friday, is he ends the tit-for-tat campaign. And now he wants to go back to negotiations. But the problem is that the longer the war goes on, the worse America's bargaining position is. So it would have made much more sense to cut a deal after the April 8th ceasefire and certainly stuck to the June 17 Memorandum of Understanding. But he didn't do that. And now he's looking for an off-ramp. But the Iranians have figured out that they have a vested interest in stringing him along and making this conflict go on for another couple of weeks, if not months, so as to weaken our coercive leverage further and get an even better deal than they got in the 17 June Memorandum of Understanding.
That creates an uncomfortable strategic paradox. If Mearsheimer is right, continuing the conflict in an attempt to gain leverage may actually make a future settlement more difficult. And Iran doesn't necessarily need a decisive military victory for that to happen. Time, economic pressure, and control over critical infrastructure can become negotiating tools themselves. Which brings us to the most immediate source of that leverage.
Oh, the Iranians clearly do. They've mined the strait that, or let me put it differently, they've mined the channel that we created, which was a violation of Article 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding. And furthermore, even if they hadn't mined it, they shoot drones and cruise missiles at any tankers or other ships that go through that U.S. dominated channel. So the only way you can get through at this point in time is to go through the Iranian controlled channel. So there's no question that the Iranians control the strait.
The Strait of Hormuz is what turns this from a regional military story into a global economic story. Mearsheimer's claim is that Iran has gained leverage over a critical maritime choke point while Washington is simultaneously trying to negotiate an end to the conflict. And that leads to perhaps the most provocative moment of the entire interview.
Pretty much recognized that the United States lost this war, internationally recognized.
Could you repeat that question?
Sure. Is it pretty much internationally recognized that the U.S. has lost the Trump-Netanyahu war?
Oh, I think there's no question about that. It's just hard to miss the fact that we have no way of shutting down this war on favorable terms. And every time someone lays out a strategy for the United States to win this war, someone easily shoots it down. And the reason is that there is no magic formula here. I just want to add one point to what Governor Christie said. There's no question that he's correct, but it's also important to emphasize that Trump cannot be trusted to stick to a deal. In other words, a memorandum of understanding was signed on June 17th, and it was Trump who walked away from that deal. And remember, much earlier in his first term, it was Trump who walked away from the JCPOA. So the Iranians fully understand now, if they didn't understand earlier, that you can't trust any deal that you work out with Trump. That means that in a future deal, the Iranians are going to want to front load that deal so they get more goodies up front than at the end, because their great fear will be that once they sign the agreement, Trump will violate it. So they need guaranteed goodies up front.
A goodie like allowing them access to their own bank accounts in foreign banks.
Absolutely. I think that is probably the principal demand that they will make moving forward. And there'll be other demands as well, but they will make sure they get a lot of goodies up front. But the one thing that they will keep in reserve, and it's very important to emphasize this, is a settlement of the nuclear issue. They have been very clear from the beginning that the nuclear issue is not settled until the end. So if we get another memorandum of understanding, you'll get a ceasefire, of course, and a number of other things will happen. We were hypothesizing that they'll get their frozen assets back, and I think that will be the case. But the nuclear deal will be kept to the end, and that will provide the Iranians with significant coercive leverage over us, because the Iranians understand that the United States, and especially the Israelis, want a new version of the JCPOA. And the Iranians surely understand that they don't want to negotiate that up front. They'll keep that till the end.
This may be the most important part of Mearsheimer's argument. He's not defining defeat simply as losing territory or a battlefield collapse. He's defining it as reaching a position where the original objectives remain unfulfilled while the other side gains enough leverage to make an acceptable settlement increasingly difficult. And if that assessment is correct, the consequences don't stop with Iran, because other countries are watching what happened and drawing their own conclusions.
Isn't this whole invasion or attack on Iran a good reason why Iran should have a nuclear weapon that would deter these types of attacks? Nobody attacks North Korea. Nobody attacks Pakistan.
Well, there's no question about that. As I often say, Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak once said that the reason he thinks Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons is because it makes so much sense. And of course, he's correct. We, of course, have gone to great lengths to make sure Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons. But at this point in time, given what's happened, the Iranians have powerful incentive to acquire nuclear weapons. And by the way, the problem has been compounded by the fact that it's quite clear that the Saudis want a nuclear enrichment capability that's akin to the one that the Iranians have. And that means that should the Saudis get that nuclear enrichment capability, they will, like the Iranians, have the ability to get a bomb somewhere down the road. And of course, this has all sorts of consequences for countries like Turkey and Egypt and Iraq as they watch what's happening with Iran. They surely understand the logic that you just laid out vis-a-vis Iran. They see what's happening with Saudi Arabia and that it's moving to get a nuclear enrichment capability, and they'll all want one too. So the danger of nuclear proliferation as a result of this war has increased significantly. And this is just another factor that we can add to that list I laid out at the beginning of the show of the downsides of this war.
What has the war done to the American relationship with its, I don't know if it's present, but it's certainly former allies in the Gulf?
Oh, it's done significant damage. There's no question about it. The fact that the United States and Israel started this war and the Gulf states were not driving the train matters when you take into account what actually then happened. These Gulf states were targeted. Great damage was done to them. And great damage was done to the alliance structure that they thought was going to provide security for them. Can they trust the Americans going forward? Are they going to want the Americans to rebuild the bases on their territory, since those bases have proven to be giant magnets for Iranian ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones? I doubt it. But there's no question that this war has done significant damage to relations between the United States and the various states in the Gulf.
This is where Mearsheimer's warning becomes long-term. His concern is that countries watching Iran may conclude that stronger deterrence, not greater dependence on outside security guarantees, is the safer strategy. Whether that ultimately leads to nuclear proliferation is uncertain. But his argument is that the incentives have changed, while Gulf governments may also be reassessing the risks of hosting American military infrastructure. And Washington may now face another problem. Its closest regional partner may not want the same exit.
I don't think he has any tricks. I think this is going to be a pretty straightforward discussion of two big issues. One is going to be what Trump does moving forward vis-a-vis Iran. And in that case, I think it's quite clear the Israelis want us to continue the war, go back to a tit-for-tat campaign, maybe go back to a major strategic bombing campaign. But the Iranians will push Trump not to end the war. And Trump, of course, I think now understands that he has to end this war sooner.
You said the Iranians, you mean the Israelis. The Israelis will push Trump not to end the war.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, the Israelis.
Yeah.
So that'll be issue number one. And then issue number two will be southern Lebanon and even Gaza and southern Syria. I think that Trump will push the Israelis to leave southern Lebanon, because I believe the Iranians are saying this time the Israelis have to leave southern Lebanon before we agree to another memorandum of understanding. And furthermore, Trump has a vested interest at this point in time in getting the Israelis out of southern Syria, because he's developing close quite close relations with the Syrian leadership. And also, I think he'd like to get the Israelis out of Gaza so that he can work out some sort of modus vivendi in Gaza. So there'll be, I think, significant disagreement between Netanyahu on one hand and Trump on the other hand on two issues. One, what to do with Iran moving forward, and what to do with Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, southern Syria, and Gaza.
And that's what makes the exit so complicated. According to Mearsheimer, Washington isn't negotiating around a single problem. It has Iran's demands on one side, Israel's strategic objectives on another, pressure to end the conflict, and growing regional consequences underneath all of it. But there is one final consequence he believes may not become fully visible until the fighting stops.
Well, I think that Israeli society is very unstable underneath the surface. I think what you see, because Israel is at war on so many fronts, is that it looks like things are quite stable. There's no question you have an election coming up, and the two or three sides, however you want to count them, are battling with each other. But Israel looks quite stable on the surface. I believe that once this war against Iran comes to an end, what you will see is an eruption of forces that reflect the tremendous dissatisfaction that's sitting there underneath the surface, and the lines of fracture among the various groups inside of Israel, I think, will manifest themselves in obvious and nasty ways once the fighting stops.
And how unstable is the Netanyahu government?
Well, I think there's a good chance that Netanyahu will be defeated in these upcoming elections in the fall. But as you and I have talked about before, you can never rule Netanyahu out. He is a wily politician of the first order, and he may very well survive. I'm not sure it makes much difference who wins in Israel. I don't think, any of the alternative candidates are very different than Netanyahu himself.
Well, the people that are competing for prime minister seem to try and be outdoing each other in their bluster for a hardline attitude toward Iran. So you're right. You're right. The only difference is in Netanyahu's personality and personal baggage.
Mearsheimer's central argument is ultimately about consequences. A war intended to reduce Iran's power, he argues, has instead created new leverage around Hormuz, strained Gulf relationships, increased incentives for nuclear proliferation, and left Washington searching for an exit while its interests may diverge from Israel's. His conclusions are controversial, and some of his claims will be fiercely disputed. But the question his analysis leaves behind is much harder to ignore. If continuing the war increases the cost of ending it, at what point does escalation stop creating leverage and start destroying it? And what happens to the Middle East after the shooting finally stops?